Hi, everyone. My name is Keith Miller. I am the curator of the Gallatin Galleries, and it's very nice to see so many of you here. So thank you for coming. Before we get started, I want to say a few thank you and acknowledgements. First of all, I want to recognize that although it's easier for some of us to be at home and watching this on Zoom, Zoom events are much more difficult or very difficult. And so I want to recognize everyone who makes this possible, starting with the events team, which is Rachel Plutzer, Teresa Anderson, and Mike Wess. And then the people behind the scenes making this event happen is Jen Burge and especially Angie DeSocio, who's the one making sure we have everything you see. And my gallery team, August, Carolina, Lily, Lux, and Rachel, who have been miraculously supportive for everything. And of course, I want to thank Mara Mills and the Center for Disability Studies, who are kind enough to help with this discussion and bring us our ASL interpreters, Lisa Reynolds and MK Adams, and Joshua Edwards, who is doing the closed captions that you could be seeing right now on your screen. First, I want to start by recognizing and acknowledging that the Gallatin Galleries is located on the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in this territory in harmony for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed, but some also remain among the historical tribal communities of the region. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. And we affirm the aspirations of the Lenape chief Tamanend, who said that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants of this land. Today, we're going to be talking with Alison O'Daniel and Mara Mills, and I'm going to give very brief versions of their bios, but you can see all of this more in depth on our website, which I'll put in the chat once we start the program. Alison O'Daniel is a visual artist and filmmaker based in Los Angeles, California. Her work has been presented at the Centre Pompidou, Art in General, Knockdown Center, and many other venues. She has received grants from the Art Matters Foundation and is the recipient of the 2019 Lewis Comfort Tiffany and Creative Capital Awards, among many, many others. Mara Mills is an associate professor at the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication here at NYU, where she co-founded and directs the Center for Disability Studies. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with Alison is going to give us a brief introduction, and we're going to see some images of the show and then a teaser of the work. So Alison, why don't you come on?
Hi, thank you for having me. I will say, maybe I'll say a little bit and then we can do the images. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much, Keith, for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Mara, for being in conversation with us. And thank you, Gallatin Gallery and NYU for having this show. It looks so beautiful and it's so strange in this new COVID time to, not be in person and not see my work and just see it like become something. And I feel like I'm really having this wonderful moment of trusting curators' visions and learning to not be a control freak about how my work is shown, and like trusting that other people understand like what I'm trying to do. And that's a really gratifying feeling. So thank you so much for that. And I'll let you show some slides and then I'll speak a little bit about the project. Okay, so I'm really grateful that Lisa Reynolds is here interpreting for me right now as I speak, and also Mary Kay Adams. And so we went through the slides, and I didn't speak so that the sign language interpreter could be, so you could just look at the images. But this project, the Tuba Thieves, started in, like, the origin point of this project was that in the very end of 2011, I think it was in November, I was in my car in Los Angeles and I heard this story on the radio about these tubas that had been stolen. And I was just coming off of having finished my first film called Night Sky. And part of the reason that this talk is meaningful on a lot of levels, but one of the things is that I collaborated with Lisa Reynolds, who is signing right now, on, yes, I see someone in the chat asked if we could describe some of the images. And thank you actually for that. I also want to say I'm a white woman. I'm sitting in front of a red brick wall with a bright kind of blown out window. I have brown sort of wavy hair and I'm wearing gray round glasses and a white and black kind of Keith Haring-ish shirt. And so some of the images that you just saw were installation images in New York City of the show that you see from the sidewalk. And so what you're seeing are multiple screens from different segments that have come from my film, The Tuba Thieves, that I've been working on for a few years. And the images are of a bunch of different scale sizes of the film, and then also reflections of the city reflected in the windows. So if you're in New York and you have the chance, you can go in and see that. So yeah, so it's very meaningful that Lisa is here interpreting for me, because when I heard that first story about the tuba thefts, I had just finished my first film called Night Sky. And that film, I made that film with a cast and crew that was very evenly split between deaf and hard of hearing people and hearing people. And I had just toured the film. The film is always intended, that film, Night Sky, is always intended to be shown live with 2 nights in a row. So it's always intended to have live musical accompaniment on one night and live sign language accompaniment on the other night. And so Lisa actually collaborated with me on that project and developed and wrote this whole sign language score that was completely her creation, with a little bit of influence from me, a little bit of feedback from me. And so it's just like unbelievably meaningful that she's here, because we kind of have this long relationship. And in November of 2011, when I heard that story on the radio about these tubas that have been stolen from a high school, at the time I was feeling really sensitive to how varied and different everybody's experience with sound and hearing had been in this like long journey on this previous project. So I'm hard of hearing, and I heard this story on the radio and I just kind of thought it was weird and quirky. And then a week passed and I heard another story about a different high school in LA that had tubas stolen. And I was like, what? And then a few weeks passed and I heard another story, and I actually started keeping notes. I have this notebook, and I just like started writing down the high schools. I wanted to like contact the band directors at these schools, because I was really struck by the fact that every time that these reporters talked about this, there was this real focus on the thieves. And I always wanted more information. I wanted to know how this was actually impacting the high school students. And yeah, just like how the sound was changing in these band rooms, and then what these tuba players were doing. And so I had this image in my mind of these tuba players sitting in class with no instruments. And I was like really moved by this image. And I started reaching out to some of the high school band directors, and I went and visited some of these schools, and I realized like this kind of spiritual image I had in my mind of these like students sitting in class was like not at all what happened. They just switched to trombone. It's like very practical. It's like not even that big of a deal in a way, but it had sparked this whole kind of like thing in my mind that I wanted to explore. And so I decided I was going to make this film called The Tuba Thieves that didn't really focus on the thieves and wasn't really going to focus on the tubas so much. And I basically made this decision that I was going to start this project that was really about listening. And so I commissioned 3 composers to make me musical scores. They didn't have anything to respond to, so I gave them images that I had in my studio. And then, and they were very random images, everything from like a picture of a concert hall to Louise Nevelson, the modernist sculptor, to her eyelashes, to the pattern that Zamboni drivers make on the ice rink as they clean away the snow. Like, it was all these very random things. And I did that because I didn't want to have a narrative in my head of what I wanted them to be scoring. And so they made me these musical scores. I listened to them for 7 months. And then I started to kind of like drag together this film from anecdotal things that I heard to things that kind of came up in my mind from listening to their music to actual real life stories that were happening. And so what you see if you go to Gallatin is a culmination of about 5 years. It's about 10 short films that I made over 5 years. That is the beginning of this project. And now I've shifted in the last 2 years to shift it into a feature length project. And so there's a lot I can say about it, and we'll be in discussion about it more. I will just say that there is a kind of narrative thread that runs through it that's based on 2 main people that I met in this process. And so one of the main people is Nike Prince, who had a small role in Night Sky. And she's deaf. I found out after we finished filming that she had had a pretty famous musician boyfriend, and she went on tour with him, and his drummer started to teach her how to drum, and I became interested in that. And so I asked her if that could kind of become one of the main stories of the film, and she was interested. And then there was one high school student in particular, the drum major at Centennial High School Marching Band, who became, I filmed with him multiple times. I did a performance with him. And then it just became clear as we were working together that he was going to become one of the main characters. Like, he just had this sensitivity and interest, and he was really fun to work with. And so it's a film that kind of follows their lives over this 2-year period of time when the tubas are stolen. And then the film tells many other stories about sound in LA mostly. So, okay, I'll stop.
And now could we see the teaser?
Mm.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Alison. I think everyone can give you the silent clap of Zoom because it's so amazing. Why don't we start with, Mara's going to start us off, and I'm going to be chatting both two things, and the website link will be coming for it so that you can have it at home for later to look at all the images. So Mara, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yes. So I'm Mara Mills. Does anyone need description of the clip, the preview that we just played? I'm challenging myself because it was about 20 short scenes put together from the film. If anyone wants me to describe it, I can, but just tell us in the chat. Otherwise, I won't describe it. Oh, someone does want it. Okay. Alison, this is a real, do you want to describe it or would you like me to try? Okay, I'm going to give an overview. What we're going to do right now is alternate a couple of questions from me and Keith to Alison, and then we'll open it up to everyone. And actually some of my questions will get at what's in the film as a whole and also in the teaser that we just saw. So the teaser, sound is as important as image in this film as it is in all of your films. And all of your films are designed to be multimodal and also to be evocative and to only enable or encourage partial access from any spectator, listener, participant. So describing them is quite a challenge because they aren't meant to have one single description. And in the teaser, what's obvious immediately is that there are two sets of captions rather than just one set. And one of my questions to you will be about the captions, so I won't say anything more about that. But basically there were about, I want to say 20, I could have counted wrong. Very, very short, I think really fast clips from what's going to be a full-length feature film itself. So it's evocative. I didn't get any sense of a narrative, but there are clips of what seem to be people, I'm not going to say this in order because I don't remember it in order, but there are clips of people seeming to steal tubas at night from a shadowy room, which I assume is a high school band room. There's a quick scene of Christine Sun Kim interpreting. I think Christine might be here in the audience. There's clips that look like just views of Los Angeles to me. There's something that looks like a recreation of John Cage's 433. It looks like a recreation of this performance that's where it looks like a musical performance is about to happen, but then instruments aren't played. What am I missing? Oh, there's scenes from a club, which I know is a deaf/punk club, but it could be any club. There's scenes of people playing cards and signing. Am I missing anything crucial? Because there's tons more.
I think the two main characters are also I think pretty clear in it. You have Nike, a Black woman with very big hair, and you see fragment of her knee hitting a kick drum, and also her standing and looking at the ocean. And then you see Giovanni, who's the other main character, at a fence. I don't know if you see him at a fence, but he's clearly younger, looks like a high school student.
Yeah, that was great. So we'll hear more about these characters and human and otherwise, I think, as I ask you some questions, Alison. So maybe I'll leap in. So I'm Mara. I'm middle-aged white woman I'm wearing a black top and I have dark brown curly hair in a bun, sitting in front of a white wall with a sort of gold thread that's tacked onto the wall. So I don't have the academic bookcase that one would expect behind me. And I just want to start by saying, I'm so delighted to welcome you back to NYU, Alison. I feel so lucky that we get to have you again. It's been almost a decade. The Center for Disability Studies, which includes Faye Ginsberg, who also is here in the audience. She's the co-founder and co-director and has been for decades, spearheading disability studies at NYU, is here. Other affiliates, Kevin Gotkin and Jan Grenier, are here, and Jesse Mail, and probably others who I didn't catch in my quick scroll. So we hosted you in 2012 for a showing of your film Night Sky, which was really, in the decade that I've been here, one of our more memorable events. And Lisa Reynolds was here, one of the interpreters here today, as you mentioned, who wrote, designed, and performed a score in sign language for that film. Night Sky was really remarkable because it included hearing and deaf actors and crew members, and it catalyzes this really wide range of viewing and listening experiences. Like I said, all of them are partial. I've seen 2 different screenings / performances of it, and I was able to access different things both times. They were very different. One version of the film that I witnessed in Irvine included a live musical score and performance, and balloons passed around to audience members to experience sound as a tactile vibration. I think Kevin Gotkin was there at that one also. Oh, Kevin's chatting. That was amazing. And then in the NYU version, we had Lisa, as I mentioned, and her ASL score wasn't a one-to-one interpretation of the music or other sounds. It was a whole separate layer of narrative expressly intended for native signers, meaning for me, it wasn't accessible. So, you know, Night Sky, in these at least 2 different versions that I experienced, it really presses on what we think we know about access and about what the sort of aesthetics and politics of access are. It's not about universal design. So, you know, Tuba Thieves, which is the follow-up, it's your current installation at Gallatin Galleries. From what I know about it, having experienced 2 events or installations of it, it extends some of these formal techniques and concerns that I'm familiar with in your work. So sound and silence are actors in the film. As you've said many times, they're actors as well as humans. And in the case of Tuba Thieves, plants and instruments. And you create many modes of dialogue in the film and meta communication, and also multiple modes of partial access inside the film, and then also at the screening events. So when I think about what's happened in your career over the last 10 years and in the disability arts world and in your filmmaking community, I'm just curious to know from you how your thinking and practice have extended or even maybe changed over the past decade. Tuba Thieves starts with sound, as you beautifully explained. Like the whole process of creating the film began with these scores you commissioned from deaf and hearing sound artists, one being Christine Sun Kim. This is like a really remarkable collaborative practice. And I see that as you're always very collaborative in your work, but I see this as even, you know, having it start with a sound score being new and different from Night Sky. And I think I'm also interested in the way the film centers theft and loss. You know, it takes its name, as you said, from the theft of tubas from LA marching bands, high school bands. In deaf studies, some deaf theorists theorize that, you know, we should replace the phrase hearing loss with deaf gain. And I think I use that sometimes in my work. I think it's a really productive formulation, but I also think the way that you stay with loss, and even maybe more importantly, theft in this film is something that we also can't forget and we need to attend to. So this is a long framing question about our relationship at the center to your work. And really the heart of it is just how has your community, your art community, and your thinking changed, or your practice changed or evolved between these 2 moments on either end of the decade?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a rich question. And I mean, again, this is like such a meaningful conversation, because I would also bookend this a little bit with, you know, when I started the Tuba Thieves, I right when I was in the beginning of this process and sort of made all these decisions about how I was going to approach this film. And I will say, like, one of the big things that, because I was coming off of Night Sky, I had experienced this really interesting thing at the very end of that project, where I had gone through all of these meaningful experiences with all of these people around their particular hearing. And then I had this long relationship with the composer of the film, whose name was Ethan Frederick Green, and he unfortunately passed away in 2015. And it was so, and I had asked him to make one of the scores. So there's 3 people who made scores for the Tuba Thieves. And part of the reason that I wanted to reverse this process and start with the scores was because I had this incredible guilt about how long like Ethan worked on my project. And I don't know, I mean, Keith, maybe you can speak to this. I don't know if this is just like a common experience that filmmakers have with the composer, but for whatever reason, that relationship out of like every technical relationship just seemed to me like, I mean, he was a friend of mine, but I felt like I was asking almost more of him than anyone. And I really had this impulse in going into my next film to reverse that and to ask the composers to basically take on the role of the director. And for me as the director to act like a composer. So I specifically like set up the project with that kind of like rule in my head. I wanted to work like a composer. And I thought there was also something sort of like weirdly empowering about that, because I am insecure about sound, and I'm like, and I don't say that as a negative or a pejorative. I'm like totally interested in my insecurity about sound. That's something that has evolved in the like last decade of just becoming so many things that have very personally and like psychologically shifted for me are this like recognition in my social experiences of how I interact with the people in my world based on my hearing, which was like a recognition I had when I was in my late 20s and was starting to really put language to something that I had experienced my whole life. And I started to shift from like things that had been really predominantly frustrating into, while the frustration continued, I still experienced like all of these, you know, disorienting, frustrating things around sound on a daily basis. I also simultaneously grew interest in those experiences, and that recognition of like being frustrated and interested in the frustration was totally this like blooming for me. Like that gave me language. So I wanted to work like a composer, and then I wanted to acknowledge all of these like very specific experiences that I had on a daily basis as like a language that this film was going to speak from. And so the intention of the film, which I think Keith got so much in this curation, is to like sort of, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit, but like the intention of the film is to like kind of hold off on access. You know, as someone who's hard of hearing, I just feel like my entrance into any world is either this like hearing world or this fully deaf world. And it just seems like with, you know, I feel sometimes like I have this kind of complicated response to access, because while I don't give anyone permission to take away anything that the ADA has contributed, like we need access, we need captions, like all that must exist. I just have very deep, profound questions about who determines those things and what value system is determining them. And I think the conversation has opened so much, like especially in the last year, it feels like, but really, I feel like I'd been saying for so long, like a music symbol for a caption is rude, and like you might as well not have anything, or like captions that censor, or captions that, you know, are just like YouTube gobbledygook. Well, I think those are interesting, you know. So I was going to say also that, you know, when this project started, I started out with this kind of proposition to myself of working like a composer. And then also I was really interested in taking all of these real events, these tuba thefts that were happening, these real stories of Nike's life, these real stories of like the people of these different events that I had learned about, like, you know, one of the weird things that happened was Steve Roden, who's a painter, who is one of the composers. I sent him this photo of the Maverick Concert Hall randomly. I had this book of like hippie architecture from Woodstock, New York, and I liked every picture in there. And I was like, well, he's a composer, I'll send him this picture of the concert hall. I sent it to him, he wrote me back. He was like, you know, that's where 433 premiered, right? And I did not. And he was like, well, you're doing all this stuff with like, you're collaborating with all these deaf people. Like you need to do something with 433. And I was like, no, that's so cheesy. Like people always want to make this comparison between like deafness and 433. And then I was thinking about it and I was like, actually I went and did a site visit of the Maverick Concert Hall because I was obviously like considering it. And when I went in, I was like, oh, this place is basically a barn. So 433, the mythology that follows it, that it's about silence, it was this loud piece that was basically like the sound of nature. And at that moment, I was like, people always misunderstand deafness as being about silence. And that was the moment where it became interesting to me. And I felt like I could tell these stories and constantly leave concerts or constantly shift the kind of, focal point of the concert so that it shifted to like a deaf point of view, or like literally leave and go into the forest. And so I'm kind of like jumping all over the place, but I will just say that at the time that I started this project, I was already a little ways in, and I saw Keith's film, Welcome to Pine Hill. And, or actually I saw your film before I think I'd started my film, but then I read this article that you wrote about working with actors. And I think in that story was like the story of your dog and this actor. And so basically this fictional film that Keith made, and you can say more about it, all started based on this like real interaction, and then was fictionalized like from this. And that was so in line with what I was doing. And then also I felt like the way that Keith was like dealing with the ethics of how you tell someone's story, how you represent somebody. And I was really interested in that as like someone who does hear, what does it mean for me to represent deafness, to represent hearing, to represent the huge spectrum of hard of hearing. And so all of that kind of just constantly informs and sort of writes the script and lets the script evolve and change. And I also will just say that like not having full access to everything is this really important, it's this really important kind of continued investigation to me, because I want the audience to sort of like experience that, but also I don't want to continue prioritizing any sort of idea of access that like lifts a deaf or hard of hearing person's experience like up to a hearing person's. I just like, I'm not interested in that kind of like hierarchical assumption, which is something I perceive. I'm not saying anyone actually like, thinks they're doing that, but I don't know if that made any sense.
You answered everything.
Yeah.
Very complex question.
I think it answered all of our questions that we've already come up with beforehand. So I'm going off book a little bit here, but thanks for the kind words about the movie. And I really look back on that anonymous email coming in as very kind of fortuitous and exciting for me. Alison, you sent it to me this morning and said, oh, I found it. I was like, oh yeah, wow. So interesting. And so much of what you just said was really, I feel so aligned with it, because one of the things, I saw John Cage perform at the San Francisco Art Institute in 1990. And one of the things I've always talked about when I think of that piece and when I've taught it in my class, arts, like modernist or those kind of things, is it seems like the one thing it's not about is silence, that it's really about the experience and the discomfort in the room and kind of the thing that discomfort creates. And like that silence, which we frame as silence, but really is people shuffling in their seat, John Cage maybe coughing, that all these sounds coming in and just kind of approaching it from a different place. And so when I was setting up the show and I'm putting all these things together, and then I finally stepped outside, I didn't set it up, Angie did, so I take that back. But when I finally stood outside and I saw the big screens up there, and then the 3 screens where the sound coming from at the right time, and there's captions and subtitles and captions. And I felt like this is so visually stimulating, but also kind of so chaotic and overwhelming. And I was reading some philosophy recently, and it came up with the word that I always love. It's the word is aporia, which means kind of a paradox of meaning, or a confusion of meaning, or an inability to find meaning from it, which to me is such like it really feels like an opening, right? It's not like, well, we can't figure that one out. It's like, oh, well, there's the opening. Let's just go in there and recreate things. And, thinking specifically about something like a Deaf Club, the final Deaf Club concert, and John Cage's 433, I guess it would be interesting to hear, and you've already touched on this, but maybe you could do it a little bit more kind of plastically, like a little bit more specifically. When you are making any one of these scenes, you could pick out, or maybe all of them. I know you start with the score, but as a filmmaker, I know that starting with anything is just you already have forgotten about that by the time you call cut. So how do you assemble these things? I think that you do it from sound, and then image, and then dialogue, and then score? How do you proceed? What's your process?
Yeah, I mean, there's no order, I don't think. I mean, like, for example, you know, this started out with this premise of like me working like a composer, but it also started out with it started out with a lot of questions. I mean, one of them was, what does it mean to hear without the ears? And I started to think of myself just as this like sponge where narrative was just like all narrative was kind of allowed. And then this other thing that I haven't finished the film yet, so who knows if I'll achieve this, but this other idea that I really want to see how cacophonous I can get and have an audience be left feeling kind of quiet, and what that even means, really. So, you know, during this like very particular 7-month period, I know it was 7 months because I went on this 7-month-long residency. I had the scores, and I basically like developed everything during those 7 months, or the beginning of everything, which has continued to change. But I just listened to these 3 scores for 7 months. And there was one day where I was in my car and I was listening to Christine Sun Kim's score, which she uses her voice a lot in the score. And I was driving behind this truck, and at the back of the truck was open, and there were all of these like racks with plants, and all of the plants were like kind of jiggling. And it just like was this really beautiful visual match between what I was listening to and what I was looking at. And I was just like, oh, okay, well, that's that scene. And that's so much of how this film kind of gets written, is like, I think of this like this really big kind of listening process, and then an attempt to like kind of retell and let the story sort of like change as it gets retold. So another thing is that I'm really inspired both in my sculpture and in my film process by this idea of like trying to play a game of like a children's game of telephone, but only with hard of hearing people, which I think would just like, you know, you have the first thing that gets said to somebody, and then it just gets passed down the line. And if it's only played by hard of hearing people, like the potential for that to just get like so beautifully fucked up is like one of the things that's like really kind of drives me, and in all of the work I'm doing. So to like kind of let in these like thefts or these like misunderstandings or something as productive and interesting. So yeah, it's like kind of going back to like the process is sometimes trying to really replicate something like the Deaf Club. We really were, and Lisa actually like was a huge help in making the Deaf Club. And you know, we really tried to get like that moment in punk history right. We had 60 deaf people who participated in that because of Lisa. We even had like deaf catering. It was just like the event, and the making of the event was so informative on what we ended up filming. And so there's moments of like where I'm very intense about like accuracy, and then moments where I'm just like inaccuracy is like the guide here. So
yeah. I just want to jump in, and I got so caught up in your answer that I forgot to describe what might be seeing. I'm a white man. I don't know if I'm middle-aged or older. So I'm somewhere in the, I'm 55 with a gray beard, and I'm wearing glasses, and I am in what I've been told looks like a hotel room, but it's actually my apartment. It's light tan with molding, and you may hear the whining of my dog occasionally. So I'll show you a picture of him if he gets too whiny, but sorry about that. And Mara, let's hear your next question.
Yeah, well, Alison, I want to ask you a question about format, partly about the final format that this project is going to take, and partly about all the different ways it's been installed, a couple of which I've experienced. And of course, at first, I was a little disappointed that we couldn't have a big live event around this installation, because so many of your film screenings are events. They're actually like the best parties. But then thinking about actually who's here for this online Zoom, I'm seeing like old friends like Sasha Wurtzel, who has moved to Florida, much to my dismay, and Shannon Finnegan and Joseph Grigley. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but artists who I really admire, Alexis Kyle Mitchell. We would never have been able to all come together if it weren't for this remote format. So it's not quite, this is its own event. And I'm glad that we're all here. But the first time I caught a glimpse of the Tuba Thieves was in 2016. It was in Queens at the Knockdown Center. I think Kevin was there and some other people who are here were there. And it was like an amazing, amazing event the night that I went. Of course, the installation was up for weeks. It included, video screens in one room, like a fluorescent light installation on the floor with textiles hanging from the ceiling in another room. And then the night I attended a live performance, that recreation of the Deaf Club that you mentioned, this 1979 Deaf Social Club in San Francisco, tied to the punk scene. And it was fun. I like smuggled in alcohol and saw like Amanda Katya and all sorts of old friends there. And it was like a party. And then here at the Gallatin Galleries, and I say here because I'm in NYU housing and can probably see the installation through my window. It's close to me physically. You've adapted, or Keith has adapted, the film to multiple large and small screens that are facing the huge, like, former factory windows of the Gallatin building and facing the sidewalk. So like the pieces of the film are very quarantined in there. And spectators can peer in and read the wall text on the windows. And whether they know it or not, they're being screened to anyone who's watching on live stream. I highly recommend clicking the link on the website and watching the live stream. It's so vivid that even in the visual and sonic noisiness of New York City, lots of people are like stopped in their tracks as they pass the windows. And interestingly, the sound is mostly absent. You can barely hear it through the windows, although there's transducers on the windows. And when there aren't classes in session, I think you have plans to turn the volume up and maybe there'll be vibrations. I didn't experience it that way. But I'm just curious about how you see these different stagings informing the feature length film that you're ultimately releasing, because it's my understanding that this is going to become like maybe even a unitary feature-length film. So I'm just curious about how these really vastly different stagings of it inform that.
Well, first of all, I didn't like peek through and look at who all is here. So when you just listed all those names, I was just like, wow, that's amazing. So thank you everybody for coming. Yeah, so when I started this project, I always have had the intention to make a feature and always have this other life that's installation as well. And so that came out of like a bunch of reasons. I think sometimes I make these like practical decisions and then just become very interested in whatever surfaces. So I was not that long out of grad school, and I was just sort of like, oh man, how do you make a film when you don't have like student discounts and you don't have like equipment from school that you can use? And I was just like, oh, seriously, like how am I ever gonna make this? And so I had written this feature-length script, and I was just like, well, I guess I'll just start making parts of it. And I got, I think like $6,000, which is so absurd now that I think of how little money I made the plant scene with, and rented a like big moving truck, like a 26-foot moving truck, and filmed that. And I basically like would go through the script over these 5 years, and I was just like, which one of these scenes can stand alone as its own thing? Like, this is maybe a disappointing answer because it's so practical. It was literally just like, what can I make now? What can I make now? And you know, when we first shot, we were like, we need to film on like the best camera because we want this to like hold up, you know, 5 or 6 years from now, however long this takes. And there has just been this kind of momentum. And then what's happened was a curator came to my studio, saw the plant piece, and offered me a solo show in France. I got there. It was this big cavernous concrete place. And I was like, I had made, I think, 3 or 4 scenes. And I just had this experience that a lot of video artists have, where I went in there and I was like, the acoustics in here are horrible. What am I gonna do? And I started thinking about these other studio visits that I had where I was telling people about the process and like talking about the images that I had given the composers. And so Christine Sun Kim, I had given her this image of Louise Nevelson smoking a cigar and asked Christine to interpret her eyelashes into music. And I would tell curators during studio visits or whoever during studio visits about this. And I would try and do this like Google image search and find that photo. And then other Louise Nevelson sculptures would come up like as little thumbnails. And there was this one Louise Nevelson sculpture that I remember every time I saw it, like small, I was like, that looks so much like acoustic foam. And so when I got into this big installation space, I was like, oh, I'm just gonna remake those Louise Nevelson sculptures out of like acoustic foam, and I'll make it as like a sound dampening quilt, and I'll just try and like solve this acoustic problem. And then this whole thing emerged, like the artist in me, you know, took over and was like, and also not just the artist in me, but the filmmaker who's like stunted because I don't have enough money to make this film, is like took over and became really interested in like the way that sound like came out of the film and like was a problem in these spaces. And then the problem of sound became really interesting. And then that then informed the writing, and I changed the script because of certain things. And so it's just been this like very long, informative, very generative process where like the act of being thwarted or impaired or, you know, whatever, like is so valuable and has become so interesting in the kind of writing of the script. And so I just like continue to rethink and expand this idea of what it means to listen, because I'm listening to the process, and the process is just telling me what the narrative is in a way. And so my intention is to have like a sit down screen feature length film that you sit in a theater one day, I hope, and or watch on your screen or whatever. And also to always have, for as long as they're wanted, these installations that take over different multimodal kind of ways of experiencing the project. So I think that it's just like, there's a very rich space for a lot of different types of audience reception, which also becomes like almost an author telling me how to approach the project, how to move forward. I just feel like, I mean, everybody who's in this world of disability justice or disability theory, like knows how rich of a space it is. And that's it, really. It's just like very informative to me. And I'm just like listening to it and moving with it, you know?
That's great. And so I'm looking at the time, and I think this will be the last question, which is too bad. Yesterday, when Mara and Alison and I talked just to figure out the schedule, we had to cut ourselves off at 1 hour. And I have the feeling we would easily be able to do that again today, because I have so many more thoughts going through my head. Speaking of which, to the all of you audience people, please write or have your questions ready to be asked into your microphone when this one is all done. We'd love to hear your voices as part of this. So I want to, this question mostly is about, I guess, either difficulty or frustration, just to let you know what I'm thinking of. One of the things that happened leading up to this show is I feel like the work is so good and so important that I really wanted to work extra hard to get press for it, which is my weakest, is my greatest weakness, I would say, of anything that I can do. Is I don't like doing it, and I'm not good at doing it. So it works out well that I don't like doing it. And so I was talking to the communications people, and I said, it's the Tuba Thieves, and it starts from this story. And they're like, okay, great angle, Tuba Thieves, but it's not about tubas and it's not about thieves. And they're like, okay, so, well, we need a picture of the tuba. I'm like, well, that's not really the image. And it really took a long time. And I feel like in some ways, in our way, it was a productive conversation, because it really made this person like, okay, I've got to rethink this thing. I don't have the language for this. And what does language mean? And how do I put things together? And so I thought that was really interesting and challenging. And I feel like the reward, of course, is that seeing the show and the work in itself it's so strong and so formally beautiful. And like the scenes are all so captivating that there is the reward at the end. And switching gears a little bit, since we've been wearing masks, when I encounter people on the street or in a, I had one in-person class, I have a very hard time understanding people with their masks. And I've had slow loss of hearing over the past few years. I have tinnitus. And someone said to me, well, you were probably reading lips a lot more than you realized and piecing together what's being said. I mean, actually right now I have the captioning on as we are talking. And I find that experience, I stopped my class from meeting in person because it was too frustrating for me. And I wonder, when you're thinking about both the gallery or the sidewalk experience and then eventually the theater experience, how much is that kind of positive side of frustration part of it for you? And I wonder if you have any thoughts. This comes more from my personal filmmaking and film viewing experience than the gallery experience. I know that there are certain films like Tarkovsky's, which you cite in the piece, that are some of my favorite films, but they're much more difficult for me to watch at home, right? Because the theatrical experience kind of offers and demands a certain kind of undivided attention where you've got to piece things together and there's no breaks and there's no distractions. And so I wonder if what your thoughts are on like the productive quality of frustration and how much patience you have for our frustration and how much frustration or how much patience you demand of us, and what your thoughts are on the audience coming to these very different versions. You mentioned like on your phone or something like that. To me seems crazy, even if you have great headphones. But what are your thoughts on all those different frustrations and the generative nature of all those interactions that one might have with your work?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I mean, I have endless patience for deaf and hard of hearing frustration, and I'm super interested in it. I have very little patience for hearing people's frustration, and I'm very interested in it. And also, like, I want to be very clear that like frustration is frustrating. I'm not like into it, but I'm interested in it, if that makes sense. Like, I think for me, that was like a profound shift of like understanding like, God, this sucks. And I'm interested in something going on here, you know, like, and also like the community has become so rich for me. Like, as I get to know more and more sort of like people working within disability justice, like that has been so interesting for me, because I have I think a very stereotypical experience too of being like a hard of hearing person who doesn't really sign. Like, I'm not really in the deaf community, even though I work with lots of individuals and like have individual relationships. And so frustration is a thing that exists on like so many levels. And for sure, I am very interested in like the hearing experience of the film, thinking about frustration in a new way, and having, on some level, having their mind open, but actually trying to cultivate that like interest in it. You know, I also, like I say to my students all the time, like, is there a value to boredom in a film? Or like the Tarkovsky film, The Mirror, I've never seen that film in a theater. My first experience seeing it was like at home watching it on a laptop. I fell asleep multiple times, woke up and was like, that was weird. And then I watched it in the daytime, like several weeks later, fully through. And I was like, I feel like I just fell asleep multiple times. And that was amazing to me. Like, that a film could really feel like sleeping through in a way when you're totally cognizant. And so I became really interested in these experiences of, you know, of the ways that we like get information flies by us, you know, how we can't access it. Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, there is so much to be said. I'm immediately thinking of like, oh, the boredom and the amount of times I've seen Sans Soleil by Chris Marker, and I've probably seen it 10 times, and I don't think I've ever not fallen asleep in it. And it's one of my favorite movies. And explaining that to someone like my brother, who likes action movies, which I like as well, and he's like, but you fell asleep, it can't be good. And I'm like, no, it's amazing. My brain was working so much that I just couldn't, I overloaded and fell asleep.
Yeah.
And Mara says that you love drone music. Yes. And there's the piece by Alvin Lucier, Music on a 30-Foot Wire, which I had a mystical experience with in college, falling to sleep to, you know, and then waking up when they said that was Alvin Lucier, Music on a 30-Foot Wire. We could keep going, I'm sure, but let's, if anyone would like to speak, you can raise your hand and I will try to be the arbiter, or you just can ask your questions in. We've got a lot of great comments from Joel Stein and Bernardo and Sophia. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, please do. And I think I might be able to see you and we can hear you out. I'm not sure best how to do this. Does anyone have a question? I know that a lot of students in Jesse Mail's class are here, and they must have interesting things to think about. So, hi, Jesse, thank you for coming. Do you want to ask a question or nudge your students too?
I'm muted. Hi, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Allison and Mara and Keith. I actually am like writing down a list of questions right now that I was gonna send my students to continue to think about. So maybe I'll just pull one up. So I'm really interested, Allison, because my students have done kind of like a captioning assignment where they choose a brief video that hasn't been captioned or is captioned inaccurately, and then use a platform to kind of like practice the art of captioning and treating it as a space for rhetorical engagement. And so at one point, you said that a music symbol on a caption is rude, and like thinking about the choices that we make. And I had never considered that before. I'm not a musician, I'm a writer. And so when I think rhetorically, I'm often thinking about like alphabetic text. And so for thinking about the musical symbol as a rhetorical choice is really fascinating for me. And so I'm wondering, so what are the alternatives then? Because with captioning, you're also thinking about space. Mm-hmm. And so how might, people who are engaging with the art of captioning choose more effective or productive ways of playing with music?
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't know that there was an art of captioning. I mean, that's fascinating to me. I don't even know that this is a thing. I mean, and also like, it's funny, I get asked this, I think a lot of people working in disability get asked a question that you're not asking, but like this sort of like, well, what am I supposed to do? Or like, what's the checklist to achieve all accessibility? And I'm always just like, whoa, I don't know. That's not what I do here. Like I know what I find helpful. And honestly, like, I think a huge influence on me making this work was that I really didn't ever see anything. I really only in the last few months have started to see captioning where I'm like, oh, cool. Like there's something there. Like I was watching some like British crime show and I was like, oh, these are much more progressive captions than what we're doing in the US. And it was just like literally some words that just gave you a feeling. Music, I always tell my students this story about how like I watched Bridget Jones' Diary when I was, I don't know how old, like old enough to know better, and was like so hating this movie and crying during like an emotional scene. And I was like, oh my God, soundtracks are just like unfairly powerful, right? Because they are completely telling me what I'm supposed to be feeling, that the film is not doing any of that work. So when you get a caption that's a music symbol, it's like, all this is going on that's like informing my emotions. And so how do you describe, like, I watch it, and because I'm thinking of like deaf friends and comrades and I can hear it, I'm just like, wow, it's cruel. It's like rude, and so just like anything that gives an indicator of this whole line of storytelling that's happening in a film, I don't think it even has to be like lengthy. I think it can just be informative, which is what captions are supposed to do. Like they're not subtitles, they're captions. So I think there's a descriptive kind of thoughtfulness that should be there that is often absent.
Thanks, Jesse. Any other questions? Someone else?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I was just wondering how, so you talked about how in your first film you used like a sign language score, and I was just wondering how you would describe that, because when I think of a score, I almost exclusively think, or I do kind of only think of like music and like the auditory sense of something that's accompanying a film. So I was just wondering what you meant by that, because you also said that you were listening to an audio score, and that I forgot her name, but the woman that made it, she used her voice sometimes. So I was just wondering like what someone would convey like through a sign language score, and just like what that would look like.
Lisa, am I allowed to break sign language ethics and ask you to come in here?
Sure.
This is a question for Lisa. She made the score, so.
Yeah, so Alison had sent me, Ethan, the actual live music first. And what I did, kind of similar to what Alison was saying in terms of just a music note. A lot of times when you interpret music, people will say high, drum sounds, high violin. And most of the deaf people I know don't find that so interesting. And it's also not really our experience. When I'm listening to music, I don't just listen to, the instruments. So I sent it to a group of people, hearing friends, and I had them write what happens, like what images are in their head when they're listening to this composition. And then I got together, and I actually got together with two deaf friends of mine, artists, Doug Ridloff and Lauren Ridloff. And we kind of just placed everything out on the floor, and, what sort of images were interesting to them, like maybe just one sentence we sort of picked up, and then we figured out how we would sign that. And then in sign language, alliteration is sort of if you take one sign and you keep the same hand shape, and then you do it onto the next. So that sort of then linked it together, and it ended up making this very sort of abstract story. It was obviously very biased. It was in no means like an actual interpretation of this, but of maybe a little bit closer to feelings or thoughts or images that hearing people have when listening to this music. Again, it wasn't supposed to be a one-to-one, and it wasn't supposed to be equal. It was sort of its own thing, but based off of that, if that makes any sense. It's a complicated process.
Yeah, but then one of the things that we did was, so Lisa brought that to me, and then we worked together, really like thinking also about like, I remember like thinking a lot about like spatial things, like just like thinking about things that would like lift up or like into the air or something, and like thinking about things in front of you and behind you. And then also the other thing that was really important to me was that all the timing cues were the same. So every bit of like live, whether it was music or whether it was sign language, all had the exact same like moments that they happened, but that they were never intended to have like a deaf audience and a hearing audience experiencing the same thing. I just like never needed that to happen.
I see that we have Shannon Finnegan and Madeline Zillick have your hand up. Shannon, you want to go first?
Hi, so happy to be here. My question is about, I see these parallels between like describing or interpreting sound and describing or interpreting visual information. And I'm just curious about if you're thinking about what the experience of the film for someone who's blind or low vision will be, or if you're thinking about an audio described version, or any of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, when I started out this project, I was really aware that my project was, both my projects, like Night Sky and this project, were pretty inaccessible to the blind and low vision. And about a year ago, I was on Sundance, had their first like accessibility impact initiative, I think it was called. And I was on there with the filmmaker Rodney Evans, and we had a lot of really great conversations about like I had gone to an early screening of his, and he was saying he kept saying sight impaired, and I was really struck by that because in the deaf community we've like not been trying not to use the word impaired since like the 70s, you know, and like I was really curious about like his relationship to this word, and now I'm hearing everybody say low vision, and we were talking about like how these things should just be called like the deaf spectrum and the blind spectrum, and I started to really think through all of these. I guess that was all like extra information, sorry, but I started to really think about how fun it will be to have audio description on these films or on the final film. And so I'm definitely going to do that. I mean, at this point, it won't be, I don't know if there's like an equivalent, maybe Rodney's film doesn't do this either, but maybe there's someone out there who's making like an equivalent to like open audio description. Like my film is open captions. You don't have a choice, they're burned in. And so it won't have like audio description that's burned in. That would definitely be like a choice of a viewer, because I think this project does come from my experience being hard of hearing. And so it's like the sound is kind of like, I'm not really giving anyone a choice in that. Right now, at this point in time in this film, I would say that would be a choice for a viewer to turn on, but who knows what will happen in the future. I mean, I think like I'm learning so much from like you and other artists who are like working in this world. And I think we're all kind of like, what are you doing? What's going on over here? And so it feels to me just like, honestly, like in the 7 years that I've been working on this project, like just a feeling of like awareness that, oh my God, other people, and I think you're doing really interesting things in terms of like poetic descriptions with visuals, right? Or in text. And so like, I don't know, I just feel like increasingly kind of thrilled about like what is like emerging in this world. And we'll see what happens, but for sure at this point, like an audio description will be part of it. Yeah, thank you.
Madeline Zolik, do you want to go?
You kind of addressed that in your last answer, but I was going to ask, growing up hard of hearing, what was the biggest barrier in accessing films? And as a filmmaker, how do you incorporate that, or if it is incorporated that at all, into your filmmaking process?
I was really aware of cinematography and staging when I was growing up. Like if people were not facing the camera, no idea what dialogue is going on. And so a lot of times going to a theater was kind of frustrating. I actually only for the first time used one of those like really obnoxious caption things that goes in your drink holder and is on this like weird arm. I only used that for the first time last year, and I found it so kind of frustrating. I sort of prefer, I mean, sort of like ridiculous, and I don't know if anyone knows what I'm talking about, but it was like kind of faulty and just weird and bad, really bad access. And so I actually kind of preferred just not like the experience that I was just so used to of just kind of not fully knowing. I really prefer to see foreign films in a theater, which probably informed a lot of my film interests anyway. So as far as like a barrier, it was, did you ask me just about film or just in general?
A film, but you can go just in general.
Yeah, no, I mean, in film, that was probably it, was just like feeling like, I mean, yeah, just feeling kind of clueless. Like my whole life, I have this kind of just like I feel like I'm always like the dog that's like, what? Like, you know, like I'm mostly with things. And then I'm like, oh, I thought I was with things. And I realized I totally misunderstood something. Like that's a very common experience I have all the time, where I am like realizing after the fact that I totally messed something up or was wrong or like didn't. And it's all related to just mishearing or feeling like I'm 10 steps behind or whatever.
So we are roughly at time, but Mara or Allison or Lisa, MK, anyone want to chime in with some closing thoughts?
I had a sort of tag along question to Jesse's, which for people who haven't experienced the Tuba Thieves yet, if you happen to be in New York, or if it's available on the website, one of the things I noticed in this installation through the wall text, which I just hadn't picked up on at the Knockdown Center, was how creative but also like arduous some of your own captioning process is. And in the wall text, it points out that for the plants, the segment that you described where it's just plants vibrating on a truck bed, like a lot of cacti, you weren't going to caption it at first. And then you decided to caption it. Christine Sun Kim made a verbal, like oral sonic score. And to do the captions, if I'm not incorrect, you tried to recreate the sounds that she made with your own mouth, your own body, and then describe the feelings of that vocalization, that the feeling of the sound production. So this is, to me, a like really fascinating it's somewhere between what Shannon was saying about description of images. It's a description of sound production and captioning. It's just, and that's just for one small scene in the film. So I don't know if you could say a little bit more about, you have these two caption tracks, you have this really unusual mode of making some of the captions.
Yeah. That actually started because I was trying to do this experiment where I was trying to see if it was possible to visually show any sound. Like I was really trying to do this through either camera movement or like showing the source of a sound rather than having captions. So when this film started, that was like my intention. And then I actually sent a rough cut to Christine Sun Kim and was like, what do you think? And she was just like, it's nice. And I was like, okay, this is not working. This is not accessible. And at the same time that I sent her that rough draft, I thought that I had a technical problem and needed her vocal track separate. And so I asked her if it would be possible. And she was like, no, I have no idea what I did. And so then I started recording, like it was all very practical. I just started like recording my voice, creating it, and to send her descriptions to see literally if she could just recreate it. And then I realized before I sent it to her that these descriptions were like exactly what I had always been missing in captions. And so I included them. And then that just like opened my brain into like realizing that the captions could become the third narrative space of the film. So sound, images, and captions. And so that was just this big shift. And that's sort of like the whole project constantly is this like response to things working or not working. And then again, I think of it like this game of telephone. Like it's like the process is this thing being misheard or not working, and then that like, not working, and then that like becoming something that becomes almost like an author of the film. Yeah.
Well, we are past time, and I'm sure there's so much more to be said. I want to thank all of you for coming and having such a nice audience, and to Mara, and of course, Allison and Lisa, MK, and Joshua, thank you for your interpreting and captioning. And to Angie, thank you again for all your technical help. And to everyone, please come see the show or see it online. Oh, and Bojana, thank you so much for coming. I just want to give a shout out to Bojana Kukliat, who single-handedly transformed the accessibility conversation in the Gallatin School, really all by herself, just a force of nature and energy, and was so positive about it. So thank you all, and bye.
Thank you, everybody.